findings that were unusual for suicidal hanging and more consistent with ligature homicidal strangulation, which included...
And it was suggested at the time that he committed suicide by doing what?
By hanging. At the time he was found allegedly hanging by a homemade ligature of sheets.
Are you saying you don't think it was suicide?
I think that the evidence points toward homicide rather than suicide.
Why?
Because there are multiple 3 fractures in the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage, that are very unusual for suicide and more indicative of strangulation, homicidal strangulation.
Let's take a look at what the medical examiner stated. After careful review of all the investigative information, including...
This is a bombshell. This is a bombshell. This gentleman was hired by Epstein's brother to review the findings. He comes back. Now, 2 points. My finger is jacked up. I'm sorry. It hurts. First point. Initially, when the report came back, it came back as undefined. The person who did the examination said it was undefined because there were certain things in it that looked as if it could be strangulation. He comes world class. He's been doing this for 50 years. I think they said this is like 20,000 autopsies. He comes back and says, this looks like a homicide. He says, the evidence, for the most part, points to a homicide, strangulation, based on the bones that were broken in his neck. He also points out that Epstein had like his eyes, based on his eyes, it gets across, again, something that wasn't necessarily consistent with the way somebody would hang themselves with a bed sheet. It comes across as if somebody choked him out and then put the bed sheet to make it look like he was hung. Well, he hung himself. This is a bombshell. Couple this with the cameras being down, the guards being asleep, supposedly check on him every 30 minutes. And yet, all of the mechanisms in place allowed for this guy to do what he did, despite the fact that none of that should have been able to take place. Here's another point. If you remember, Epstein was found in his cell, on the floor apparently, unconscious. The guy who was in there with him had bodies buried in his backyard. He was a cop. He says, I have no idea what took place. And not just no idea what took place. Eventually he comes out and says, look, I've been threatened. Like, all of this is just really, really bizarre. And also, one last point. Understand what this means. Understand what this means. If Epstein indeed was strangulated, meaning somebody came in, for whatever reason they did it, whether he was a spook, whether he was some agent of Mossad, whether they did it because he was a pedophile, whether they did it because he was an apex pedophile, whatever the reason they did it, whether somebody greased somebody's hands, whatever the reason they did it, if that took place, all sorts of mechanisms had to be put into place to allow that to take place. Here's the catch. If Epstein could choke himself out, it is also possible that somebody could have gotten in and helped him suicide himself. And that's the point. If this is true, this body should be looked over again for secondary reading. If your name is Barbara Sampson and you're responsible with this case, what happens if you call it a homicide? What happens? What happens? Think about it for the moment. Think about what I'm saying. The highest profile prisoner was in jail, federal custody. Every mechanism that was in place was put in place to prevent him from doing what people thought he might do, meaning off himself. In one case, you find him on the floor. You put him in suicide watch. Great. He's not supposed to be taken off of suicide watch until a psychiatrist or some up to that effect allows him off suicide watch. But we are supposed to believe that just so happens the cameras were down, just so happened both guards were asleep, And all of these mechanisms broke down that allowed this to take place. If Barbara Sampson says it was a homicide, it would to some degree mean or insist that something within the context of that prison allowed that to take place, meaning allowed somebody to come in there to do that particular act, to have those cameras not necessarily be working, to have those particular guards narcoleptic at that very specific moment where that was taking place. If she says homicide, what happens? What happens? What happens? Meaning, is there an incentive to any degree to say this was a suicide? He killed himself. Despite the fact that the evidence itself lended itself to it not being that. The answer, of course, is yes. If you don't want to deal with the drama, the answer is yes. And even if... Welcome to the Soapbox. Let's start there. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. This video will be immediately and instantly demonetized. One last point that I want to read. Because ultimately his brother made the point that, look, if he's been offed, we need to, if somebody killed him, what does it mean for us? Now, I suspect the brother was more so like everybody else in the public, screaming, BS. Nobody believed this. And now you have a guy who's been doing this forever, a dinosaur, comes back and says, in my great and vast and amazing experience, this will look like a homicide. I gotta be honest, you should have a secondary source. Check this. Independent. Check this. Let's take a look at this. This is the Miami Herald. All right. It's right here. Baden's observations first aired in an interview on Fox and Friends Wednesday include that Epstein suffered multiple fractures in his neck. Injuries, he said, were more consistent with strangulation than suicide by hanging. Epstein, who was found dead August 10th, had 3 fractures on the left and right sides of his larynx, Baden said. He told the Herald that it is rare for any bones to be broken in a hanging, let alone multiple bones fractured. Those fractures are extremely unusual in suicidal hangings and could occur much more commonly in a homicidal strangulation, said Biden, who added that there were hemorrhages in Epstein's eyes. They were also more common in a strangulation. Now, understand why. If he's hanging himself, the angle and everything else and the way that he dies is different than if somebody applying pressure creates the hemorrhaging in the eyes and the breaking of the bones. That's his point. This looked like it was done by force, not by him doing it himself. Let's keep going. All right. Baden told the Herald that the pathologist who actually conducted the autopsy, Dr. Kristen Roman, also had trouble determining that Epstein hanged himself and initially determined that the manner of death was pending. That's what I mentioned earlier. The autopsy did not support suicide, Baden said. That's what she put down. Then Dr. Sampson changed it a week later, manner of death to suicide. The brother has been trying to find out why that changed. What was the evidence? Sampson has not released the full autopsy report. Now, Baden makes the point that yes, there could be more evidence that we don't particularly have. But all of this looks dicey. Coincidentally, cameras down. Coincidentally, the guards are asleep. Coincidentally, a guy who's supposed to be checked every 30 minutes, dead. So right here. In this case, Baden said he saw a photograph of Epstein's cell after the body was removed. It showed ligature fashion from an orange bedsheet on the floor of the cell. Baden said he was told, but shown no written report, that a corrections officer found Epstein's body on his knees with orange ligature around his neck, tied to the top of a bunk in his cell. I was wondering how he died. And essentially, they're saying he took a bed sheet, put it on his cell, and found him on his knees. He was stone cold dead when they found him, Baden said. He had been dead for 3 hours, rigor mortis had set in, and it was apparent he was dead, yet the EMS and didn't photograph how the body was found. Baden said Simpson's conclusion sends a message that there is no need to further investigate how Epstein died. And that's kind of his point. This looks like a cleanup job. Ultimately, the person who initially did the autopsy said it was undefined. I can't, it's pending. I don't know. It looks strange. Again, she doesn't want to say homicide. It is probably not in her interest to say homicide. So she puts, it looks strange. Sampson comes in, suicide. That's what it is. The gentleman who's paid by the brother, and who only, for the most part, is looking at this from the standpoint of whether it's true or not, and using his great and vast experience to do so, says that's a homicide. That's more consistent with a homicide. Now, the medical examiner disagrees with him. Who do you believe? Who do you believe? I don't believe the medical examiner, I tell you that much. I'd like additional information. Whose DNA is on the ligature? Was the FBI able to get any information from the jail cells video and hall video? Did they find it shown? Did they find it shown him hanging himself up, or someone unauthorized went into the cell from the hallway? Did the FBI interview any of the inmates? Did they interview any of the guards who were allegedly asleep? Baden said these are questions that should be answered before concluding that Epstein committed suicide. And he said questions about the federal facilities apparently lapse should also factor to explore. That's kind of my point. It's one thing if one thing happens, but when you have a series of things that are happening that allowed a particular outcome, when all of those things are kind of weird and lead to a certain coincidental behavior, there should be questions. Why take it as an act of faith? Following the autopsy, it was revealed that 2 prison officers who were assigned to monitor Epstein at 30-minute intervals fell asleep, and that at least some of the security cameras in the wing were not operating. Baden, who has conducted more than 20,000 autopsies, said that in the 50 years he's never had a prison death where 2 corrections officers fell asleep, nor has he ever had a case where 3 bones were broken in an alleged suicide by hanging. He said that in hangings, most deaths occur as a result of compression of obstruction of the cardiac arteries in the neck, which restrict blood flow to the brain, causing death. The fact that Epstein suffered fractures suggests force was used. Who do you believe? The prison, or the guy who wants to get to the bottom of it? He has no incentive to lie, I don't think. I mean, he's being paid by the brother, right? But the brother is not necessarily saying, I need this to be a homicide. By the same token, does the prison have anything, or would it have any incentive to hide? And the answer, of course, is yes. Would the medical examiner, meaning the person who did the original autopsy, who couldn't bring herself to say suicide, is there any incentive at all for her to not put homicide? The answer, of course, is yes. All sorts of shit pops off. If you put homicide and the cameras were down and both of the guards were asleep, all of this looks pretty bad. And you start asking some uncomfortable questions about the prison system and who was responsible for allowing this homicide to take place. It seems like they want Epstein's death to just go away. No questions asked. Baden is asking questions. His brother is asking questions. And yes, it's the brother of a pedophile. But in this case, I kind of want those questions answered myself. I wanted him alive, not dead. And whether he suicided himself or had help being suicided, we should know. It's a federal facility. Our tax dollars pay for it. Like, share, subscribe. Think so. Space Jockey, how do you know if he has no reason to lie? Well, that's fair, Space Jockey. And I did say, as far as I know. But the examiner seems to be Like, he doesn't seem to have going into this with biases per se. The guy's been doing this forever, including several other high-profile cases, as opposed to a prison system that let a guy kill himself or had somebody kill him with all sorts of coincidences to allow that outcome. Why would I automatically trust the prison system that allowed that particular outcome when it seems, and I would argue to you, that a large segment of the American population looked at this and said, bullshit. And I don't think his brother is crazy for saying the same. Everyone has biases. That's true. Depends on what those biases are, right? But it may be possible that the brother has a bias of just getting to the truth of what happened to his brother. Did you ever consider that? Meaning the brother wants to know what happened. In which case he sends this guy, who is a medical examiner, world famous, world class, 20,000 medical examinations, to look upon it. Everybody has biases. I don't know why he would go in looking for homicide. I would say this: the fact that the original examination came up with undefined or pending, whatever the term they were using for it, got across that that person had certain problems with the way this was went down. Meaning she looked at this and says, I can't tell that this is a suicide. This looks like something else to me. She didn't want to write it down. She didn't want to write it down. Like, share, subscribe. Whatever you want to say of the medical examiner's biases, meaning the guy that the brother sent in. The guy that the brother sent in, to some degree, agreed with the initial assessment of that first person who had trouble calling it a suicide. It looks like a cleanup job. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks all.